Jordan Mechner, welcome to Tech Talk with Daniel.
Hi, happy to be here.
I'll start off by saying that Prince of Persia had a profound impact on my life. As a PC gamer and someone who was just starting to learn how to program, it was essential to me because it demonstrated that a game that runs on minimal hardware with a monochrome screen can still be remarkably realistic. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. That's great to hear.
But we'll get to Prince of Persia in a moment. Let's rewind a bit. How did you get into programming?
Well, I guess I was 12 or 13 years old when I started to see computers. In my high school, they had TRS-80, Commodore PET, and until then, I'd pretty much been more into film. Making animated movies was one of my interests, drawing cartoons and comics. So I wasn't really a particularly scientific or engineering oriented kid. I went to the AV room in our high school because they had video equipment, closed circuit video cameras. This was 1976, 77. So I was drawn by the video equipment, but then I saw these computers and kind of started to get curious. And I had friends who were a lot more knowledgeable about that than I was. And at a certain point, I started to go to the IBM Thomas J. Watson Research Center in New York, close to where I lived. One night a week, they would have sort of open house. They would open up their campus to high school kids to come and use the computers. So that's sort of how I learned to program, first in BASIC and then in APL. I just thought it was fun. It was engaging. It was challenging. And then at a certain point, I realized that these computers could actually play games, and programming games started to interest me. And this was right before the arcade games started to really become fun. There was, Tank War and Lunar Lander were kind of the old time 70s arcade games alongside the pinball machines. They weren't really that much fun to play, but then Space Invaders came along, and that was the first game I really got addicted to. And so when I saw that the Apple computer could play Space Invaders, with high resolution graphics, and it was just like the arcade game, but I could play it at home, and I realized that someone had programmed this on the Apple, and that programming could kind of lead to being able to make a game as cool as Space Invaders. At that point, I was hooked.
And the first game you developed on the Apple II was a Breakout game. And Breakout is usually my go-to game whenever I'm learning a new programming language, as it's a great way to check the object-oriented programming aspects of the language. But in your case, it wasn't an object-oriented programming language. So how did you handle things like the brick management in the game while using a simpler programming language at the time?
I mean, Breakout was one of the games that came on cassette with the Apple II. I think Steve Wozniak himself had put the code for Breakout into the manual, the red book that came with the Apple II. So that was a program that I could look at the listing and, either a game would come on a cassette, and then you could sort of pause it and look at the basic program listing in memory and sort of read it and see how it was done. But a lot of times programs came in magazines or in books. There was a book called 101 Basic Computer Games. And so you sort of spend an hour typing in the basic program listing for the game and then run it, and hopefully it would play correctly. And if there was a mistake in what I'd typed, then I could sort of see where I'd made the mistake. And so that was a way to start learning to program, just by looking at finished games and see how they worked. Breakout was, it was interesting to just see how Wozniak had done it. And, there wasn't really anything special about the bricks that I remember. It was a low resolution color graphics game on the Apple. So it was just starting to learn how that stuff worked.
And what interesting programming mechanics did you learn while reviewing the code?
Well, I mean, on the Apple, the interesting thing was that every now and then a program would call a routine that seemed to exist outside the program. And this was these little machine language routines that were kind of hiding in the computer. So that was something I didn't understand at all. None of the basic books explained what that was. And there were some clues in the Red Book. But again, I wasn't an engineer. I didn't really know how the computer worked. I was just trying to, how do you get it to do this? And so trading tips, with friends, and also magazines were really important. Like, Soft Talk magazine, Creative Computing magazine would sometimes have little articles that would explain how machine language worked. So that was sort of the next step. It was sort of like this arcane black magic within the computer of, can you actually write code like directly in the machine language, which was so much faster and more powerful. You could do things with that a basic program couldn't do. And Breakout was a pretty simple game, but more and more, like as I was learning about programming, the games that were available were also starting to become more elaborate and sophisticated. And Space Invaders, of course, was the ultimate. That game was just a black box. It was entirely in machine language. It used high-res graphics. And I couldn't even imagine, how can you program the computer to do something like that? But little by little, one instruction at a time, I kind of started to figure out how 6502 assembly language worked. And eventually got to the point of being able to code routines, and then eventually code whole programs in assembly language.
And what did the code consist of mostly? Was it more game logic or memory management or graphics?
I mean, on the Apple II, there weren't really any, there wasn't a library of routines that you could use, and there weren't any tools to speak of. So it was really very, it was really down to the level of the pixel. You had to kind of figure out which screen locations in memory corresponded to which pixels on the screen. And then you had to just fill that memory location with what you wanted to see. So, for example, to take a simple game like Asteroids, that was really the first machine language, fully animated arcade style game.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big project that took me about 6 months, when I was in high school, and I was trying to copy the arcade game Asteroids. So there, for example, to draw one of the asteroids rocks on the screen, first I had to, on graph paper, figure out what the rock would look like and translate that into bytes, so that if there was a byte which had just one pixel turned on, that pixel would be a 1. And if the pixel was turned off, the screen was black, it would be a 0. So those translated into numbers. So I had to figure out what numbers would correspond to the shape of an asteroid's rock, and then put those numbers into the memory area that corresponded to that area of the screen. And then if the rock was going to move, I had to shift it all one bit over, and then erase what was in that memory location, all those memory locations before, and replace it with the new one. So getting objects to move around the screen was really just a matter of putting different numbers into the 8K of memory that represented the screen. All of the software to do that had to be written. That is, so I had to write, before I could program Asteroids, I had to program a tool that would take a shape, any shape from memory, and put that into the screen, based on a X and Y coordinate locations. So then there needed to be a routine to translate those X and Y coordinates, on the 280 by 192 pixel screen into a memory location. And so there was a little formula to do that. And so as far as how to draw the shapes of the rocks, I had a little pixel editor. There was obviously no Photoshop or anything like that yet. So I had to use the keyboard, up, down, and left and right with keys to turn pixels on and off, to define the size of the rectangle, to change the colors. And over the years, I sort of developed this tool into something that I used a lot. I used it for Asteroids, and then for my next published games, Karateka and Prince of Persia. It was really just an evolution of that drawing tool.
And how did you handle things like collision detection?
Again, it was sort of depending on the case. For Asteroids, it would, like to see if your spaceship collided with the rocks, it would be looking to see if there was a rock in the vicinity, because I knew the X and Y coordinates of all the rocks on the screen, and then seeing if it was close enough. Another way to do it would be to actually check at the moment of drawing the pixels of the rock to see if there was another pixel underneath, and if that pixel was part of the spaceship. So those are two different ways to do it. And one was, more accurate, the other was quicker. And in Prince of Persia, things like collision detection with a wall, it was all sort of tricks. It was all specific to that particular game environment as to whether there was a wall there. The code had to sort of know that there was a wall and figure out that in this case, if the character is running, he should bounce off the wall.
And during that time, you also worked on adventure game mechanics. For example, you created graphic adventure games way before Sierra released their King's Quest series.
King's Quest was pretty early. I was writing text adventures when I was learning BASIC. Scott Adams had some text adventure games, which were pretty sophisticated in a lot of ways. He was doing certain things like before anybody else. And then there was Zork and Infocom's games. There was some pretty sophisticated text adventure stuff going on. And I had the idea of doing a graphic sort of a text adventure that would have graphics. But instead of doing that, I kind of got in the direction of doing more action games, and Karateka probably, like, it had elements of an adventure game because it had a story and characters, but really it was told through, arcade style animation through, you had to run and punch and kick and try to get through the game story that way. It wasn't about typing in commands.
So in 1984, Karateka was released, and I've been pronouncing it Karateka all my life because that's the way it's pronounced over here. I know that in the US...
that's how I pronounce it too.
I know that it's pronounced in the US Karateka. What is your preferred way of pronouncing it, and has it remained consistent throughout the years?
I always called it Karateka. That sounded right to me. Mm-hmm. And since moving to Europe, I found that people here in most languages also say Karateka. And in Japanese, there's really no stress on any syllable. So I guess it would be something like karateka. But in English, you really have to put a strong emphasis. And I later found out that almost everybody in America besides me called it karateka, which, there's the word karate in there, so it makes sense. But also, if you say it fast, it kind of, it sounds like erotica, which is a little misleading. And then there's also the word caretaker, which if you're not careful, it can sound like that. So, but, this was in the 80s, there wasn't yet TV and radio or podcasts talking about video games. So there was really no way to find out how something was supposed to be pronounced. When I heard about Choplifter for the first few times, I thought the game was called Shoplifter and that it was about stealing things from stores.
And what were the biggest technical hurdles you faced while developing Karateka for the Apple II? And how did you overcome them?
So when I started making Karateka, I was a freshman in college, and I had already spent a few years making arcade-style games like Asteroids, which I followed with a game called Death Bounce, which was kind of like a somewhat more original version of Asteroids, where the balls bounced instead of wrapping around the edges of the screen. But none of these games quite got published. So I was kind of, of course, I was studying psychology. I had classes to go to. I had a lot of interest. So it wasn't just the computer games, but I really thought, I've spent so much time learning how to program. I really want to make a game that's good enough to get published. And I kind of felt like the industry was moving so fast that if I didn't really keep working hard at it, I was going to be left behind. Because every few months, a game came out that just blew everything else away. And the games that I had made in 1981 and the first part of 1982 were already being surpassed by the games that were coming out. And Choplifter from Broderbund. Did you play that game? Do you remember it? It's a game where you play a helicopter rescuing hostages from these barracks. And so it had scrolling, it had kind of parallax 3D, and it really told a story. And the little characters were animated, and they waved to you to try to, you kind of developed an emotional attachment to these little characters on the screen, and kind of felt bad when one of them got squashed or you failed to rescue them. So with Karateka, I wanted to do a game that would have that kind of scrolling, cinematic, smooth animation feeling that, that Choplifter had. But I wanted to do it with large characters who were whereas the choplifter characters were like 8 pixels high, I wanted to do characters that were 40 pixels high. And the idea was that the game would be built around karate fighting. So you could punch and kick, and that the movements would really be, very human and lifelike. That was the idea. So the main technical challenge, first of all, was to move large shapes on the screen smoothly and fast enough to get a frame rate, that was, that would give the illusion of motion. There was a game called Swashbuckler that had large characters and sword fighting, which was one of my inspirations for Karateka. But the frame rate on Swashbuckler, it was like, 1 frame per second. It was just really alternating between poses. It wasn't real animation. So there was that. There was just the matter of getting, doing the animation fast enough to be fluid. But the other thing was that I wasn't a trained animator myself. And when I tried to animate a character, it just came out feeling kind of choppy, and, it looked like programmer art. It didn't look like the kind of, lifelike Disney animation that I saw in my imagination. So I used a technique which I later found out had been used by animators going back to the 1920s, called rotoscoping. I filmed a live actor doing the karate moves, punching and kicking and so forth. And then I actually filmed my dad wearing a karate outfit, climbing up onto the hood of the family car and running back and forth in the woods in front of our house in New York to get the kind of a reference for what those movements actually looked like when a human actor did them. And then I traced the frames from the Super 8 film on a Moviola editing console, frame by frame on tracing paper with a pencil to get the silhouette. And then I used those tracings to sort of retrace and import the silhouette into the computer. And then I could start cleaning it up with my pixel editing tool. So that was the rotoscope technique that I developed for Karateka.
Now, this entire process of rotoscoping everything and then putting it into the computer and animating it was something that took several months. Now, the main question is, when you started the process, were you certain that you'd get the result that you eventually got, or were you at first hesitant that it may not work? Because after all, you worked on it for so long, it might not have worked the way you wanted it by the end.
There's so many unknowns. I think my memory would probably be very hazy about all of this, by now after 40 years. But I actually kept a journal while I was making Karateka. It's something I started doing when I was 17, when I started college, and I've kept it up all my life. So I was able to go back and reread my journal and sort of see what I wrote. And that's really useful for kind of correcting memory errors. And because often I would remember things a certain way, but then when I read what I actually wrote in my journal on the day, I would realize, this must be what actually happened because I wrote it. So the journals that I kept during the making of Karateka, from 1982 to 1985, while I was at college, I actually published those as a book. It's on my website at jordanmechner.com. So you can actually read the book and sort of see from like one day to the next what things I felt confident about and what I wasn't sure about. And then sometimes I was just, way off base. Like I would think things would go a certain way and then they didn't. I would be excited about something which then didn't pan out, and eventually I would drop it. So all of those ups and downs and the uncertainty, of the development process is kind of in there. So with the rotoscoping, there, I wasn't sure if it would work. I wasn't sure if it would be too rough or too, jiggly. It would just look weird. And then when I cleaned up the rough tracings, kind of made it look like a clean, proper video game character, I was kind of worried that the illusion of life that had been present in the sort of the rough, scribbly version would disappear and that it would just start to look mechanical and computery again. But, the results were actually very, I was very pleased with how it came out. Pretty much the first day I saw the first test, I was like, Yes, that it works great, and I used that process for Karateka, and then I was so happy with the results that I went on and used it again, in a slightly evolved version for my next game, Prince of Persia.
And can you talk about the process of refining the controls and creating such a satisfying feel for the combat sections?
I mean, that also was a matter of iteration, kind of experiment. From my first conception of Karateka, I had a much more elaborate control scheme planned, and you can sort of see, looking at my sketches from the time, that you could do high kicks, low kicks, different kinds of stances. There was a whole system for like how much damage each different kind of hit would do. And it just kind of got simpler and simpler in the course of development. And I ended up, because I really wanted to just use the buttons. There were 2 buttons and a joystick. So really it's punch and kick, and the joystick controlled the height of your blows, and then you can move from left to right. So your distance from the enemy is a factor. So it's really just that. It's not like modern combat games where you've got a whole bunch of different buttons on the controller, and different combos can unlock different kinds of moves. The combat in Karateka was very simple. So it was really just a matter of having the enemies fight in a way that would, you could react to what they were doing, and, you could kind of anticipate their moves and fight better. I mean, that was really the test: is, can I get better at this game by playing more? Because if there's no difference after I've been playing it for 2 hours than there was in the beginning, then it's really just button mashing, and it's not a satisfying game. There had to be some things that you could learn, skills that you could develop. One interesting moment, which actually came really late in the development of Karateka, was that I realized the enemies were moving too fast, because I had both characters moving at the same speed. And the thing is, that didn't leave time to see what the enemy was doing and react. So I actually slowed the enemies down to move at half the speed of the player. And that changed everything. That suddenly made it a game, because you could then see that the enemy was beginning to kick. And in the time that it takes, the eye to see that frame of animation, send a signal to your brain to interpret it, and then you decide to press the button, you press the button, and then your character reacts. Like, you needed that big speed advantage in order for it to be a fair fight.
And looking back, what do you think is Karateka's most lasting contribution to the gaming industry?
It's interesting. There's in 1984, when the game shipped, it's kind of like you send a game out into the world, and it's on floppy disks, and that there are people out there playing it, but you don't really get to talk to them. There wasn't social media, there wasn't the internet, aside from a few people who sent me letters, who actually put letters in an envelope and a stamp on the letter and mailed it to Broderbund, who then mailed the letter to me. I really couldn't. I didn't really know who was playing it. So it was many years later that I started to get this kind of feedback. And just this year, Digital Eclipse published The Making of Karateka, which is an interactive documentary. And it's, you've seen it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, they reconstructed the whole development process, but also they interviewed game developers like John Tobias, who did Mortal Kombat, and, Tom Hall, and Rafe Koster, about, and they were sort of narrated their own experiences with Karateka, playing it for the first time, and how it inspired and influenced them. So that was really touching and very meaningful for me to hear, because just to realize that the game had gone out there, and that all these people who were young future game designers, actually got to play it, and they noticed and thought about the things that I'd put into it.
Well, if you look at Commander Keen 4, 5, and 6, you notice that a lot of the mechanics are very similar to Prince of Persia, especially with hanging off the ledge that wasn't available in Keen 1 to 3. So Tom was especially influenced by Prince of Persia in your games. Now, Karateka also had an Easter egg in which if you place the floppy disk upside down, the game would boot up upside down. What was that all about?
Yeah, well, Well, before we were talking about the technical question of how to figure out where the XY coordinates would translate into the Apple II memory area for the screen. When I got to Broderbund at age of 19 and met real programmers for the first time, because being self-taught and just having kind of traded tips with friends, there were a lot of gaps in my programming knowledge. And Roland Gustafson, who was in charge of the copy protection for Broderbund and was a brilliant hacker and programmer, just taught me a lot in a very short time. And one of the first things he told me is, why aren't you using lookup tables? In fact, to get the starting Y coordinate for one of the lines of the 192 horizontal lines of the Apple II screen, I had just been calculating it with a little formula, which I'd gotten out of Steve Wozniak's Red Book, which kind of told you how to do it. But Roland said, it's much faster if you just calculate out those 192 values ahead of time and then just put them in memory, and then you can just look it up. A lookup is much faster than doing a calculation. So that was so obvious. I just felt dumb for not having, started doing that 3 years ago. So I used that for Karateka, and it sped up the animation, which was great. But as a side effect, I realized that you could, if you inverted that lookup table, suddenly all of the graphics in the game would simultaneously go upside down. So Roland and I just did that for fun. We inverted it, and then we were trying to play Karateka upside down. And I don't remember which of us had the idea, what if we just put this on the B side of the disc? Then people who put the disc in upside down would be playing the disc upside down. And we had the thought that they might not realize that that's what was going on. They'd be confused, and they would pick up the phone and call Broderbund tech support and say, I bought this game and it's playing upside down. What's wrong? And then the tech support person, could have the sublime satisfaction of saying, well, sir, have you checked the disk in the drive? Because if it's upside down, that could be causing the problem. And then the person would go away happy, and they would, maybe for the rest of their lives, they would think that that's how software worked, that if you put the disk in upside down, it's always going to play upside down. So we went and we told our idea to Doug Carlston, the CEO of Broderbund, not really seriously thinking that he would really do that, because it added to the cost of goods to put something on the side B of the disk, which is normally blank. Somebody actually had to physically turn the disk over, for every copy on the assembly line and record it twice. But Doug said yes. And
now, in 1986, the DOS version of Karateka was released. In your journal, you wrote that when you first tested the final version of the PC port, it was sluggish, had frequent disk access, and had a few minor graphic glitches. And you also wrote that you believe that the PC version was 50% of what it should be. Can you elaborate a bit on the issues you've encountered and what, in your opinion, caused them?
Well, at that stage of the computer industry, there was such, every machine had its own microprocessor. So it wasn't like today when programs are written, in C++ and you can just translate that code to a different machine. Karateka on the Apple was programmed in 6502, and then the PC had a different microprocessor, so it all had to be reprogrammed. So that basically meant a programmer had to look at my code, try to figure out what I was doing, and then write new code that would do the same thing. And at the time, my feeling about the PC version was just like, it's not smooth, it's choppy, there's all these little mistakes. It's just, I wasn't satisfied with it. I felt that the Apple version was just so much faster and smoother, and there were so many little details that worked correctly on the Apple that weren't working correctly on the PC. And unfortunately, that's just the way it was. So anybody who played Karateka on the PC had a different experience, which by the standards of 1985, 86, I didn't think came up to the level of quality of the Apple or the Atari or the Commodore versions.
So was it basically lost in translation? The hacks and the methods that you used in the Apple II didn't translate well to the PC version, or were there things that were not available for PC that were available on the Apple II in terms of efficiency and graphics?
No, the PC is actually a more powerful machine, and should have been able to do it all. I mean, to get the game running on the Apple or the Commodore or Atari was more of a technical challenge. It's just a matter of craftsmanship, really. An example, I guess, would be translation. You can take a book or a poem that's written in one language, and you can translate it into another language. You could either do a beautiful translation, or you could do a terrible translation that misses a lot of what worked about the poem and is kind of a little awkward to read in the new language. It's not a feature of the new language. It's just a measure of the translator's work.
So they basically translated the code verbatim from the Apple II, and it didn't work on the PC as well, because the PC had other methods that would probably run better, but they didn't put the time into actually converting everything to PC methods.
Yeah. I mean, converting, it's not just converting, it's really writing an entirely new program, writing new graphics routines, writing, basically everything has to be reprogrammed to achieve the same result, but it's the attention to detail and kind of, seeing all the little parts of it that are happening in the original game, and then trying to find a way to pick that up and kind of recreate that in a different way on the new machine. And I mean, it's a very difficult challenge. It's, if you look at the ports of, different games in the period, there's a lot. Sometimes the ports are just way off, like they're not even close. I was a perfectionist, of course, so I really wanted the PC version of Karateka to be everything that it could be, and it was okay.
So I presume that out of all of the various versions of Karateka that were available at that point in time, the Apple was always the definitive version?
Well, the Commodore and Atari versions had better music because they had, better music capability. They could actually play multi-voice music with chords and harmonies, whereas on the Apple, you could only play one note at a time, and you had to freeze the screen to play a note. You couldn't be animating a character and playing sound simultaneously. On the Atari and Commodore, you could. So Veda Cook, who programmed both of those versions, put a lot of effort into the music and the sound and into making it look good. And my dad, who composed the music for Karateka, actually composed a new orchestration with harmonies and multiple, with actual chords, whereas in the Apple II, it just had single notes and arpeggios. So that's definitely a feature for those versions. And in the Digital Eclipse documentary, there's a great video with Veda, where she explains kind of what the particular challenges of the Commodore 64 and the Atari were at that time, and how to kind of make choices that would best reflect what the original game had been. And it's interesting. I mean, it's a lost kind of handicraft, but it's very evocative of that period when doing a port was really an artisanal thing, sort of done by one person, and there were very few people who could really do it well.
In 1989, Prince of Persia was released for the Apple II. Now, since you talked about the music that your father composed for Karateka, let's talk about the music he composed for Prince of Persia. In the Prince of Persia manual, there's a short explanation about the music. It says the following. The music of Prince of Persia uses a Leitmotif approach in which each theme is associated with a specific character or idea. The basic themes are Prince, Princess, Jafar, Danger, Sword, Shadow, Death, Time, and Magic. Why did you find it essential to add that passage to the manual? And furthermore, was the Leitmotif approach an artistic choice or a necessity due to technical limitations?
I'd forgotten that was in the manual. Interesting. Do you remember which manual that was?
For which version? The manual, I think it was the manual for the IBM.
Hmm. Yeah, that's definitely the way that my dad and I thought about the music. My dad is, he's an educational psychologist, by training, but also a very talented amateur pianist. So I'd grown up, hearing him play classical music, and went to the opera a lot, and that was sort of the culture that he came out of. My dad was born in Vienna, Austria, in 1931. So he came to the U.S. as a child refugee in World War II. And, obviously I'm American, grew up in New York, but there was always that kind of European culture, classical music, and the Leitmotif approach. Wagner really pioneered that with the Ring of the Nibelung operas, and also, I guess, Peter and the Wolf by Prokofiev, where the different characters are represented by different instruments and melodies. So I had seen, for example, in Star Wars, which came out, I was 12 years old, that John Williams' score for Star Wars used the Leitmotif approach. There's Luke's theme, there's the Darth Vader's theme, there's a love theme. Indiana Jones, also by John Williams, used that approach. A lot of Hollywood films had. So, it just seemed natural to use this approach for Prince of Persia and for Karateka as well. My dad, right away had the idea, we should have a theme for the princess and a theme for the villain. And he was directly inspired by operas. The theme for the villain, Akuma, in Karateka, owes a lot to Hunding's theme in Die Walküre, in Wagner's opera, The Valkyrie. Of course, Wagner had an orchestra, we had an Apple II, playing these little beeps and buzzes, but we did what we could.
Now, you talked about your journal for Karateka. I have my journal for Prince of Persia.
Oh, great. Yeah, the Stripe Press hardcover book with illustrations. Yeah, they did a great job.
And first of all, it's a very interesting read, especially the technical difficulties that you've encountered along the way, and a lot of the tests that you've performed in order to get rotoscoping to work in this game particularly. Now, the main thing is, a lot of the times things were very stressful according to how you depicted it. And so when did you actually find time to write down your feelings or even your to-do list for the day?
I started in college keeping a journal, and it became a habit that, in a way, it sort of helped me also to organize my thoughts. It was kind of a moment to myself at the end of each day when I would write down what happened. And I wouldn't always have time to write a long entry. Sometimes I would just write a couple of lines. Some days I would skip. But, for me, writing in the journal just felt like, the way to end the day. And, it was, I wasn't thinking that this would become a record that I would ever look at again or that I would show to anybody. And I certainly never intended to publish it. I would have been horrified if you'd suggested that to me in like 1985 or 89, that other people were going to be able to read these journals someday. But I found value in the process just of daily writing in the journal. And also, sometimes I would pick up journals from months before or years before and reread them. Not very often, but it's sometimes something would come out of that. It's a little bit like almost like the I Ching. You can pick up this book, open it to any page, and read something, and it feels like that thing contains some wisdom that's useful to you in that moment. Reading my journals from years ago, sometimes I would read a passage where I was struggling with something that had relevance to what I'm going through now. And it's almost like myself from the past is giving advice to myself now. And it kind of helped to give perspective on what I was going through. Not just the technical aspects of game designing, but also the the emotional roller coaster of working on something that takes years. There's days when, I would think, this is just, it's not going to be good enough. It's never going to be as successful as Karateka was. Why am I still working on Apple II games? I should just, stop this and go off and like live my life and do something different. And reading a journal entry that I'd written on Karateka years before in a similar moment, was kind of reassuring. It was kind of helped me remember, oh yeah, this roller coaster is just kind of how it is. It's I'm going to feel like excited about it one day and discouraged the next. And I should just kind of let that process happen, let it be what it is, and kind of have faith that it's going to work out.
And did you ever read an entry and think to yourself, why did I spend so much time on that problem? It's pretty straightforward.
I mean, yeah, because it's all in there. I mean, the blind alleys too. Sometimes I would spend, weeks on something and then end up, realizing that the game was better without it and just cut it out. But that's part of the process too. Yeah, and it's not just game design. I think it's also true for screenwriting, for writing and drawing comics, which I'm doing now. It's true for invention, for any, it's true for scientists, for any technical field. You just have to figure that at least half of your time is going to be spent doing things just to find out that that's not part of what was needed. But at least then, you tried that, and that helps you to get to discover, the approach that is going to work, that you are going to stick with.
Now, in 1990, the DOS version of Prince of Persia was released. And that's the version I played as a kid on my PC computer with a monochrome screen. I had the Hercules graphics card, which is the minimum requirement for Prince of Persia. Now, in Israel, Prince of Persia was incredibly popular. Over here, the game was called The Prince, Duel in the Palace, but it didn't stop people from calling it the Persian Prince constantly. And in the second game, they even changed the name to the Persian Prince instead of Duel in the Palace, because it no longer relates to what's happening in the second game. You're no longer in the palace. So this is the cover art.
Wow. Oh, so that says Duel in the Palace, huh?
Yeah, it says The Prince, and the tagline is Duel in the Palace. And you'll notice that we have added a sword to the logo to make sure that you understand that there are duels inside the palace. Now, one interesting difference is also on the back cover, because in the US release, you have 4 bullet points, and we have 5 bullet points. And the 5th one emphasizes the duel gameplay again by stating that you can duel with the palace guards. We're pretty obsessed with duels for some reason.
Oh, it's a feature.
Now, the prince seamlessly transitions between the animations without any obvious breaks. How did the control scheme map the button presses to specific frames of animation based on the context without any significant lag or glitches?
So the animations in Prince of Persia really started with, kind of, there was the run, there was the jump, there was the turning around. So it was kind of and all of those had come from rotoscoped footage of, in this case, my brother David, who I'd filmed doing the moves, and did the sort of 1985-86 version of the rotoscope process. This time using videotape instead of Super 8. So looking at the footage, both the video and looking at the individual frames, I would kind of figure out which frames looked like the right moment to branch from one sequence into the next. So like in reality, for example, running and jumping, like the last few steps before like you plant your foot and jump, your body is actually doing slightly different things. You're doing a different pose than if you're just running straight ahead. But in a game, like the character couldn't anticipate that much because you don't know at what moment the player is going to press the button. So it was about kind of finding a compromise where you want to feel as the player that the game is reactive, that, I pressed the button and then I jumped. But if it's too reactive, then you lose the illusion of reality. And earlier games like and a different style of game like Mario, the jump is instant. Like whatever you're in the middle of doing, you press jump, immediately you jump. But in real life, you can't just suddenly jump. You have to, your feet are alternating as you're running. You have to plant your foot. You have to push off that foot. And all of that takes many frames. So it was really sort of about what's the right point to cheat and switch from the running loop into the jumping animation, and which frame of the jumping animation should it transition into? Because you can't, like if the player is about to plant one foot, you can't start the jump at a moment where that foot is further back. It has to, that foot has to keep, sort of stay where it is. So it was really just a tree that I just had to work out for every possible combination that is going from running into a jump, running into stopping into jumping. Then there's the standing jump. There's the running jump. There's the turning around, turning from a running position, turning from a standing position. There weren't really that many, but there was a certain number of things that I just had to get into place, for the animation to feel like complete and fluid and like you could do anything from any position.
And it does feel natural, but the thing is, at the time, did you fear that players might think that there's a certain lag with the key presses, given the fact that, unlike Mario, like you said, the jump isn't instant. So you hold the up key, and then it takes a second before he jumps. So how can you teach the players that this is the mechanic that you need to use, or that this is not a lag in the game? This is the natural gameplay.
Yeah. I mean, it was really just the only way to find out was to do it, to implement it, and then give it to players and see if it worked. And it's, much like with Karateka, there were other things that were kind of experimental, like the cross-cutting, things about the animation that, could have been frustrating, could have been confusing. I just have to try it. And I think for a certain number of players, Prince of Persia was frustrating. Even today, I still have people say, yeah, it's weird the way that you have to line up at the bottom of the ledge before you jump, or it's, the way that it doesn't jump instantly. But, at the time, I found the compromise that seemed to strike.
You should ignore these people.
Well, I mean, I did. I sort of listened to the feedback from everybody who I was giving the joystick to test out Prince of Persia, and I would adjust it a little bit based on, how people were reacting. And at a certain point, I thought, well, this seems to work for most people and feels good to me. And, that's what the game was.
And I presume that you chose rotoscoping because it was your go-to technique from Karateka. But did you consider any other techniques for the Prince's movements? Or was rotoscoping the only way to go when you started working on the game?
Yeah, I mean, at that time, rotoscoping was the only way that I knew to get smooth, lifelike animation on the screen. And, it had worked well for Karateka. And, 5 years later, for Prince of Persia, there still wasn't anything else. There was no other technology that could do that. So that was sort of inherent in the conception of Prince of Persia from the beginning. I'm going to do a platform game, a modular game with puzzles and traps, but it's going to have smooth rotoscoped animation like Karateka. That was kind of the basic idea.
And looking back, what would you say is the most underappreciated aspect of the original Prince of Persia?
I feel like I've been wonderfully lucky in the ways that the game has been appreciated, so far beyond what I hoped for at the time.
But there must be something.
Honestly, nothing springs to mind. I kind of feel like all the little details that I put into Prince of Persia, kind of hoping that players would notice and appreciate them. Like there's always been somebody who did notice it and mentioned it years later. And I'm like, oh, wow, someone noticed that.
Okay, so let's talk about the copy protection. The game has a level in which the prince has to drink a potion matching the first letter of a word in the manual. How did you create that level, and how much of an overhead did it add to the game?
Oh, are we talking about the PC version now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I didn't program the PC version. I programmed the Apple version that shipped at the end of '89, and a small Broderbund team actually did the PC port. And there, I was, that was kind of a dream situation because these were people that I knew. I had a desk at Broderbund, so I knew Lanscredi and, the whole, that whole little unit that did the PC version of Prince of Persia. So I was able to see what they were doing. I worked on the graphic sprites, and I would, so I was really able to kind of keep an eye on it and answer their questions and also the PC version was so much, had so much more technical capability than the Apple had, in terms of the graphics, the colors, the sound, digitized sound effects that Tom Reddick created. Again, as with Karateka, my dad recomposed the Prince of Persia music, not just for the PC, but also for a variety of different sound cards that could really play music. So the version of Prince of Persia that probably most PC players know now, is that sort of enhanced, souped up PC version with VGA graphics. But I didn't program that, so I don't really know what's under the hood. I just know, my experience, looking at it and playing it.
And for the original version, you hired Avril Harrison for the title screen. Are you aware that Avril Harrison is an iconic character in a LucasArts adventure game?
A character in the game?
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't. What game?
So in Monkey Island, the close-up of Elaine Marley, the governor, is based on Avril Harrison.
Ah, yeah, it looks like her.
Now you know. So, in 1992, the Super Nintendo version of Prince of Persia was released, and in addition to improved graphics, that version also had 20 levels instead of the original 12, which is why you had 2 hours to save the princess, as opposed to the original 1 hour time limit. And one interesting thing about the SNES version is that it underwent censorship compared to the uncensored Japanese Super Famicom version.
I didn't know about that. Although that rings a bell. Maybe I was told about it at the time. Was this to be published in Germany? Was there some kind of...
No, so these are the changes. In the intro, the guards in the Japanese version beat the young prince, and this version was removed from the Super Nintendo version, probably due to violence. But the fact that they removed this part of the intro made the music out of sync after this scene, because the music is supposed to sync to the rest of the scenes, and it no longer does. And furthermore, there are several pentagrams on doors in the Japanese version that were removed for the Super Nintendo version. So on the right, you see the Japanese version, on the left, Super Nintendo one. Same goes for level 19. Pentagram, no pentagram. And for the final fight, pentagram on the floor, nothing on the floor.
So the pentagram has power in Europe that it doesn't have in Japan. People were worried.
So it's interesting that they took the time to change the graphics. So I understand that you weren't part of the production of this version in any way.
No, I remember seeing the Super Nintendo version for the first time and just being impressed by all they'd put into it, and playing the first level. Usually when I would get a port, I would just sort of play the first level and kind of see how the animation felt and how, what they'd done with the music and so forth. I didn't play the whole game, but with this one, at a certain point, I was like, wait a minute, that's not in level 1. Exactly. And I realized that they added all of this other stuff and that I didn't know where to go. So that was kind of exciting because I felt like I had the experience of all of the other people in the world who played Prince of Persia, which was to, at a certain moment, you don't know what's coming and you see it for the first time. I never had that with Prince of Persia because I'd built all the levels. I'd spent three years, putting those bricks into place, so I knew where everything was. But the Super Nintendo version, there I was kind of lost and surprised.
And still in 1992, the FM Towns version and the Game Boy version and the Sega CD version were released. Did you take part I presume you didn't take part in the production of these versions, but you played the first level on each one of them?
Yeah, I wasn't on any of the port teams, for Prince of Persia. I mean, I was, the Apple II version, of course, and then that's sort of when I stopped programming. Prince of Persia on the Apple II was the last game that I actually coded myself. So after that, I sort of supervised the ports. So the PC port, that was done at Broderbund, so I was there. The Mac port was done by Presage in, also in Marin County. So, and I knew the people who were doing it, so I was involved in that. The Amiga port of Prince of Persia was done by Dan Gorlin, who had programmed Choplifter, but there he really he was able to use the Apple code because it's the same microprocessor, and he used the PC graphics. So that was just so seamless. Like there was almost nothing to say, but yeah, that's perfect. But all these other versions that were kind of developed by different teams by companies that I didn't really know what they were going to be until I saw them. I never met the teams. Most often they were in countries that I'd never traveled to. So I just kind of saw them for the first time when they were done or almost done.
So what is the definitive version in your opinion?
For me, the PC version was of the ones that I worked on, I felt like we put everything we could into it. It was a more powerful machine. It had the best graphics, the best sound. So yeah, I would say PC. And the Amiga version being very close to the PC in most ways.
Well, it's a good thing you said that, because the PC version is the version we played over here. So we got the best version.
Yeah, I was going to say the Mac version also has Acclaim because it was higher resolution. Mm-hmm. So, the Mac has very good port. And that was interesting because, while that port was in development, Apple started coming, they kept issuing new Macs, and every Mac would be different. Like sometimes, at one point they had a color screen, and then they had a bigger color screen. And so, but then, the original Mac was black and white. So there were three completely different sets of graphics. And so the development team, every time there was a new Mac, they kind of say, well, do we want to support this? Well, I guess we should because it's the newest. So that actually added 2 years to the development of the Mac version because it ended up being this, it ran on every kind of Mac that there was. And that was actually a good thing because during the time that this port was being developed, kind of the industry was advancing. And so by 1992, when the Mac version came out, at that time, there were computer magazines, video game magazines, and mass market, mainstream media like Time and Newsweek magazine were also starting to write occasionally about video games. And to, it wasn't like in the 80s when only a few people knew that video games or Apple II computers were even a thing. By 1992, this was kind of in the public awareness. So journalists, in most magazines, had Macs in their office. That's what they used to work. You could do desktop publishing on a Mac. And so Prince of Persia was one of the few games in color, with sound and, action gameplay that you could play on a Mac. So I think a lot of journalists, could enjoy it and play it at work. And for that reason, it kind of got more publicity than the previous versions had. So for whatever reason, in 1992, that was really, there was the release of the Mac version, there was the re-release of the PC version in a new and different box. And then there were a bunch of console versions in different countries that sort of had been quietly in the works that all came out and kind of started to be popular around the time. So for me, 92 was the year that Prince of Persia really hit. For the first 2 years, the game was out there and people liked it. It got good reviews, but I felt like nobody really knew about it. And the sales were not really very much. I was proud of it, but it didn't feel like the game was a huge hit or a phenomenon or anything like that. It was just like this game that, we'd all done our best, and I was proud of it, and the people who played it liked it. But then in 92, suddenly it was like, okay, I'm starting to run into people out in the world who have heard of Prince of Persia and played it, and I'm seeing it in magazines. So it felt like that's kind of when it tipped. And, at that point, Prince of Persia was a thing.
So you started working on Prince of Persia 2 before it actually became a hit?
My journal would have the exact date, but I think, was it like in 91 that Broderbund greenlit the sequel? Yeah, there was a point there when, after Prince of Persia shipped, they were kind of saying, well, let's wait and see how it sells. And then it wasn't selling very well. But my product manager, Brian Ehler, and I, kept lobbying and saying, come on, look at these reviews, look at this, and we've got this version coming and that version coming. And then at a certain point, Broderbund said, okay, yeah, let's go ahead and do the sequel. And that was, that decision was kind of validated, a few months later when the sales really took off. And I think at that point, they were very glad that there was a sequel coming.
And how did you approach the storyline in the second game? And were there any specific influences or inspirations that guided the narrative direction of the game?
Yeah. So this was 91. At this point, I had moved from California to New York, and I was, studying film. I was taking 16 millimeter filmmaking classes. I was sharing an apartment with my brother David in New York. He was going to NYU as an undergraduate. And I actually asked our high school friend, Mark Abrams, to consult we'd played Dungeons and Dragons in high school, and, Mark was a great dungeon master. And so I just kind of hired Mark as a consultant to help develop the Prince of Persia universe. And, it was, it was interesting because I would say, okay, here's my idea for the sequel, Jafar comes back and this and that. And Mark would say, well, where did Jafar get his magic? I'm like, well, I don't know. He's a vizier. He's a sorcerer. Magic. It's the 1001 Nights. And, Mark was very disappointed in me. He would say, oh, come on. Like, if there's magic in the world, it's like it has to come from somewhere. Like, not all people have magic, right? Why does Jafar have magic? Who gave it to him? What are the limits of his powers? Can he do this? Can he shapeshift? Of course, he's thinking like a dungeon master, and he needs to know like everything about the universe. So he kept asking me these questions. And at one point, and this stuck in my mind, he said, what you put in the game is just the tip of the iceberg. Like, look at Tolkien with Lord of the Rings. I mean, he wrote these books, but he developed entire languages, and like he knew all of the history of his kingdoms, and their mythology, and what's true and what's just legends, going back thousands of years. That's why Lord of the Rings feels solid, because there was all of that behind it that you don't see. So you need to know the Prince of Persia universe that well, in order for it to hang together. And then you'll have answers to all of the questions. And it's not to go too far down it, because there's kind of a limit to that approach too. I'm not sure that that's the right way to tackle every kind of story, but I did spend a certain amount of time like with Prince of Persia 2 thinking about, okay, where did Jafar's magic come from? And, who was the prince, before he, came to Persia and fell in love with the princess and got thrown into the dungeon and became prince and all of that. So the story for Prince of Persia 2 was kind of I figured out kind of a mythology for the universe that made sense. So 1 and 2 fit together, and there was going to be a Prince of Persia 3 that would kind of tie it together. Prince 2 ended on a cliffhanger, with the witch who's got the serpent S tattooed on her forehead. And so I had an idea already for like where that was going to go in part 3.
And what technical challenges did you face while developing Prince of Persia 2 compared to the first installment? And how did you address those challenges?
Well, I mean, of course, the technical challenges were much less, because at this point, 92, 93, PCs were, powerful PCs were kind of standard. There was no question of developing a game that would run on an Apple II or a Sam Coupe or, any of the formats that the first game had worked on. So it was, in a way, it was like the sky's the limit. Instead of just having the action be constrained to a palace, with two different types of bricks, the prince can go on an adventure. He can go across the world. Every level can have its own graphics and different kinds of enemies and monsters. The music could be a lot more. The sound effects were far beyond what we could do with the first game. So it was really more a matter of kind of keeping it finite in the sense that a team could actually do this with the budget that we had and the number of months that we had, without needing to bring on like 5 more graphic artists. So it was always a negotiation. Again, with at this point, I was the designer. I wasn't coding it myself. I kind of gave the team the specs, and then they would budget it out and say, well, if we need to build these traps, this is how long the programming is going to take. This is how long the how many graphic artists we'll need for this many weeks. And then it would be too much. They'd say, well, this busts the budget. Jordan, you got to make it smaller. So I'd be like, okay, maybe if we take this trap out and we, we use this monster twice. It was that kind of a negotiation.
You should have told them to move over and that you'll code the game yourself.
I remember one memorable moment. My friend Tommy Pierce, who of course is a character in in my journals, she had some of the key ideas and contributions to Prince of Persia, and of course in my graphic novel Replay, she's a main character, and you can kind of see more about those events. Mm-hmm. But once I was going into a meeting with the the Broderbund executives to try to defend the budget and convince them that that they needed this much, Tommy said, "Tell them that if you cut," I forget what it was that we were talking about cutting. She said, "Tell them if you cut that, it would be like doing the Wizard of Oz with only the Tin Man and the Scarecrow because you didn't have the budget for the Cowardly Lion." The Wizard of Oz being one of my favorite movies from childhood. I actually said that in the meeting, and I think it made a difference. Anyway, whatever it was that I was fighting for that day, they agreed to it.
I went over the design document of the game, and they mentioned that there was a problem with the technical aspects of how the dead guards were handled in the first game, and that the solution that you used in the first game will not work in the second game, given that there's more than one guard per room. Do you know about that technical issue?
I've forgotten. It rings a bell, though. Yeah, something to do with how long do the guards stick around after you've beaten a guard? Like, does the body of the dead guard stay there, or does it get forgotten when you go to a different screen?
Yeah, so in the first Prince of Persia, the dead guard was still considered active, and that meant that the program had to keep track of the coordinates and the status, while in Prince 2, since you had multiple guards per screen, you couldn't do the same because of technical limitations. Even with the powerful computers of 1992 and 1993, couldn't handle the locations of all of these guards, especially after they died. So they became part of the background.
Yeah, now that you say that, it that rings a bell. Wow, you've really dug into this. I'm impressed.
Yeah, I usually do extensive research whenever I talk to my guests. And the way I do it is, first of all, I watch all of their interviews, all of their filmed interviews, all the videos. Then I read all of the written interviews. And in your case, I had to read the journals, both journals, as well as the journals you have on your website, as well as replay. So I did some extensive reading these past couple of months.
I'm feeling that there's a lot that's that's fresher in your mind than mine.
Well, a lot of the questions I ask, I know the answer to but I still want to hear it from you. So that's the thing. In August 1993, while working on Train, which is the original name for The Last Express, you made a decision to shift to 3D modeling system with ray tracing, very similar to Myst, which was popular at the time, despite having very limited knowledge in that area. What prompted that decision?
Yeah, so this, I seem to remember reading my journal entries from this period quite recently. I think because I must have just posted it on the website, right? Because it's 30 years ago this week. And I think that decision to do ray tracing, it was in, I guess, like mid to late 1993.
Yeah, August 1993.
Okay, yeah. So it was just in August that I would have reread that and posted it. I think I was looking for a style to do The Last Express in, and looking at adventure games, which often had this kind of side view graphics. I was kind of ready to do the game that way, but then seeing Myst and realizing that ray tracing 3D rendered images, could be so like photorealistic or hyper realistic, and painterly at the same time. I just thought they were beautiful, and that this was a way to present the interior of the Orient Express in a way where you could really feel the textures, of like the hand tooled leather and the sort of the Art Nouveau decorations, the stained glass. I mean, you could do stained glass so that or pebbled glass, so that it would really, you would feel what kind of glass it was. And that obviously hadn't been possible in computer games up to that point. So, I was curious about that. And I remember flying up to Washington, where the Miller brothers, or where Cyan was located, and sort of having them show me what they had done with Myst and how they did it and how this worked. And so I went back to San Francisco and just said, yeah, let's do this. Let's do the game this way. And at that point, it became instantly, like in a moment, like 5 times more expensive, and took longer to do. But I only had a vague idea at that point of what it would take to do it. I just knew that if we could make it look that way, it would be absolutely beautiful.
The production of The Last Express was in a time period that was very problematic in terms of game design, because there were so many changes between 1993 and 1997 that you could hardly keep up. Because in 1993, you had the CD-ROM drives. And then in 1993, you also had The Seventh Guest, and FMV games started being popular. And so I presume that during the production of The Last Express, while filming the actors so that you'll eventually rotoscope them, you probably thought to yourself that maybe you could use this footage to, well, not that footage, but film footage that can be used as FMV. So how did you try to keep the original game design intact while trying to avoid the outside pressures of all that is changing in the realm of PC gaming in those years?
That's an interesting question. This was a period like 1990, from 1993 to 94. Like, I had sort of taken a step back from the video game industry. So even though I was, we were doing Prince of Persia 2, and I was working with the team and developing the levels, like, I wasn't really invested in the future of the industry in the same way that I had been when I was doing like Karateka and Prince of Persia, where it's like, this is what I'm doing. The technology advancing, I want to keep up. In like after Prince of Persia and Prince of Persia 2, I really wanted to make films. And I was, writing screenplays. I was making short films. I went to Cuba, did a short film there, and watching the game technology evolve, and then looking at the games. Like, I didn't really like FMV. I didn't have any desire to do an FMV game where, we can videotape actors and digitize that and make that be part of the game. To me, that was like the worst part of games and the worst part of film. It's like, it's never going to be a beautiful film because it's just this, really sort of like low resolution video. It's going to be sort of B-movie production values. It's never going to be really good acting or good cinematography because we don't have the form doesn't really lend itself to that, and we don't have the budget for it. And you can't really project it on a screen and have it be beautiful, and look good and sound good the way that a 16 millimeter or 35 millimeter film could. And then as a game, the best thing about games, which is that they're real time and they're fluid and dynamic and interactive. It's like you're not watching it, you're playing it. With full motion video, that kind of went away. And now actually it's like you're pressing a button and watching a bit of video, and the gameplay is sort of, it's just feeding this decision tree of which video are we going to play next. So I didn't like any of that. I didn't want to had no interest in doing that kind of game. And I liked doing Prince of Persia 2. I was ready to do a Prince of Persia 3 and finish the trilogy. And, if 2D action games could sort of get more visually immersive and the action could get smoother and more elaborate, because of the new technology, I was fine with that. But of course, the industry went in a different direction because there was this other technology of real-time 3D and then online multiplayer games. So then when Castle Wolfenstein and Doom came along, and those were first-person shooters, like that was what everybody was excited about. That was a new kind of game that hadn't existed a few years before. And so it was just sort of clear, like that's what the future of the industry was. That's where the excitement was. It wasn't something that interested me, like as a game designer, as a player. It just wasn't my kind of thing. I mean, I could see that it was cool and that it was fun and that, these death matches were, very compelling. That's just not where my own taste was leading me. So The Last Express was kind of a surprise in that I hadn't planned to do a game like that. It's just kind of like just a bunch of my different interests and ambitions kind of aligned there. I'd been living in France. I had discovered French graphic novels, European comics, which are, sort of these, there's a different style from American comics. And I sort of had the desire to tell an interactive, graphic novel adventure story in a way that was interactive and immersive. That was kind of an interesting challenge. And then the visual aspect of doing a game that was set on board a train, just fascinated me. And it also seemed to make it possible in a way that, because it wasn't yet possible to do a game where you could like go around in an open world city, like later on in GTA 5 or something like that. The computers of 1993 couldn't yet represent that. But a train was only 7 cars, laid out in a row. And there's only 30 people on the train. There's the passengers and the crew, and they're going back and forth and they're all doing their things. So it seemed like that was like a contained world that would be possible to represent in a way where you could actually see the expressions on the people's faces. You could see what they were wearing and their body language. And it could be like a sort of an animated cartoon. By recording the voices, the performances could be very subtle. The dialogue could be sophisticated. The story could be sophisticated. And so all of that coming together made me think, okay, maybe this is the way to use like the experience that I have in making computer games with Prince of Persia, and then the experience that I've gotten in making short films, directing actors and so forth in film school, and my interest in comics and graphic novels, that kind of narrative. Plus the fact that this story would use all of these different languages, and it was kind of evoking Europe in this period before World War I, which was a historical theme that was, interesting and meaningful to me. So the chance to do all of that at the same time was kind of what lured me back into the game industry, to move back to San Francisco and do Last Express.
And The Last Express was met with critical acclaim, but it never achieved the same commercial success as Prince of Persia.
No, not even
Do you
close.
think that the decline in popularity of the adventure game genre was responsible for this, or do you think there was some other factor?
Well, I mean, in retrospect, I think that the point and click adventure game genre never had the popularity of action games. I mean, if you compare, even the best selling adventure games, with the exception of Myst, didn't do anything close to the numbers of like, Doom or other action games of the time. It was just always kind of a market that, people who loved those kind of games loved them, but they weren't in the tens of millions. You know, when Myst came out, like there was kind of a moment when we thought, okay, now the whole industry is going to change, and if you do a game that appeals to the general public, and has a really like wonderful and sophisticated story, you can sell 10 million copies. Well, that was true for Myst, but it wasn't true for any other game. So
Tell it to LucasArts.
I mean, I don't know the numbers, but I don't
the numbers weren't that great. But the only reason why they kept going was because LucasArts was a subsidiary of Lucasfilm, so they had the money to actually create adventure games without making too much money out of them.
Yeah. And with Last Express, of course, I developed, I built a studio just to make that game. And, all the money that we raised, and then, my own money as well, spent on the production. And so then, because the game, was expensive, by the time it was done, we were broke and had to, shut our doors. We didn't have a second project behind that. So as a business model, that was not a very smart way to go about it. I wouldn't recommend that. As an artistic venture, and also as a human adventure, shared with the team, it was one of the greatest experiences, I think, for me and for a lot of the people who were part of it. And so with the passage of time, 25 years later, I'm very proud of The Last Express and really happy that we did it. But yeah, at the time, as a business decision, I wasn't that smart to do.
Well, at least we got to enjoy one of your adventure games. As an adventure game fan, I always appreciate adventure games from the 90s, and this was a great one.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, there's something. I love all my games, in different ways, but The Last Express, there's something about the, people who love The Last Express, like really, I think it's touched people, in a certain way, because there's no other game quite like it. And even today, I'm always meeting people who will tell me something surprising, about their experience with The Last Express, or the ways that it's, inspired or influenced their work. So it's been very meaningful. And, the fact that now it's, you can play it on mobile, you can, it's actually playable on today's devices. It's, I'm very glad that it's out there.
Okay. Let's talk briefly about Prince of Persia 3D. In 1999, you were credited as the design consultant on Prince of Persia 3D. Now, there's a magazine ad for this game. Is that you in the back?
That's me. That's my cameo in Prince of Persia 3D.
I always wondered if that was you, and now I know. Okay. That's all I had to ask about. So, what can you share about the development of Prince of Persia 3D?
Well, I wasn't part of the team, so I don't know really what went on behind the scenes, but I know, like, it was hard. I know it was a tough development for a lot of reasons. For some reasons that weren't just technical, it was about the changes at Broderbund, an acquisition. There was the whole learning company thing happening at the same time, and I knew the people on the team. They were great. It was really tough for them in a lot of ways, I think.
And did you enjoy the final game?
I actually haven't played the final game. I played the first 2 levels, and the PC that I had at the time, this was I've always sort of been a Mac, an Apple person, so I didn't have a PC at home. And so when this game shipped in '99, I just didn't have a PC that at home that could really play it. And I tried, but because it was a very demanding game, it would crash after the second level. So that's really, I've seen videos online, but as far as playing the game, that's as far as I got.
Okay. In 2003, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time was released, in which you're credited as the writer, game designer, creative consultant, and you also got special thanks on top of all of these things.
Oh.
What can you share about the development of this game?
Well, I've talked so much about that. You probably know it all already. It's that was a great experience. It was a great team. It was my first experience with Ubisoft. And at this time, Ubisoft Montreal was one of their newer studios. It eventually became their biggest studio. But the headquarters was in Paris, in France. And so, Yves Guillemot, the CEO of Ubisoft, had called me in LA to talk about rebooting Prince of Persia at their Montreal studio. And so, at this time, I was mostly focused on screenwriting. I was living in LA, kind of trying to build a career as a screenwriter. And so I thought, well, to go back and do a video game again, looking at Prince of Persia 3D, I was like, if it's going to be like that, I don't see it. But after I went to Montreal, met the team and sort of saw what they were doing, for the PlayStation 2, okay, this is going to be something completely different. It's not going to be at all like Prince of Persia 3D. This is, if we can get the character to run vertically and run on walls and bounce off walls and chain moves together in this fluid way. Plus, the team showed me a test of this technology that an engineer on the team had developed, which you can probably guess, press a button on the controller and it rewinds the gameplay. It's actually recording your gameplay, and like on a videotape player, can go backwards. At that time, in 2000 and 2001, 2002, this hadn't been done in a game. So that was wow, we can build the whole game around this. So those two things, the sort of the parkour acrobatic movement and the rewind, just blew my mind. And so I joined the team and had a wonderful experience in Montreal, making this kind of reinventing Prince of Persia, because we didn't feel like it was a sequel. We were really, at that point, it had been so long since the first Prince of Persia game that we really needed to make a new game that would work even for players who had never heard of or never played the first Prince of Persia. But at the same time, for players who were a little older and did know the first game, it needed to feel like it was sort of part of the same thing, that it had the same spirit. And that was just, it was a great team, a great challenge, and it was really a great moment to do it, because the new consoles were just at the point where we could do things that hadn't been possible a couple of years before, and yet there was so much potential that hadn't yet been exploited. So a lot of these things we were doing for the first time.
Still in 2003, there was a Gillette campaign featuring the Prince of Persia. What prompted this collaboration, and in what ways did it enhance Gillette's marketing strategy at the time?
Oh my gosh, I can't believe you found that.
Yep.
Was that only in France?
Well, I found it only in French, so I presume it was only in France. But it was, you got a special, it had special packaging that had the Prince of Persia on the cover, and you got the blade itself, the Mach 3 turbo blade, as well as shaving gel. And of course, the CD with a demo of Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time and the full games, Prince of Persia 1 and Prince of Persia 2. Oh. What do you have to say for yourself?
Kindred blades?
Look at that close shave on Prince of Persia.
It was like someone on the team actually had to, render a pose where he's admiring his shave. That's
well, I presume it's not from the in-game cinematics.
I love it. Thank you for finding that.
My pleasure. So in 2005, Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones was released. Now, you're not credited in any way in the game, not even with a Prince of Persia originally created by credit. And furthermore, in a December 2005 issue of Wired, you said, "I'm not a fan of the artistic direction or the violence that earned it an M rating." Now, given that we're from a generation that was traumatized by the jaw traps in Prince of Persia, the original Prince of Persia, what type of violence was so appalling in the Two Thrones?
Yeah. I kind of felt bad about that interview when it appeared in Wired because, putting myself in the shoes of the team reading that, it's kind of like, it's like, they'd done the game. And so here I'm coming and looking at the game and saying, well, I don't like it. That's not my taste. That's not my style. I wouldn't have done it that way. I kind of feel like that kind of feedback doesn't really help anything. I mean, of course, all of us, we're always, playing games and going to movies. And like, as players, as viewers, we have our taste, like, oh, I hated that movie, or I loved that, that moment, whatever. But to say that, like, in print, as the creator of the original game, I don't think it. I'm sure it wasn't great for the team to read, and for myself, having done that interview, I also felt like that was just a part of what I'd said, and it was kind of taken out of context. So I kind of felt like it's just better not to review Prince of Persia games like publicly and give my opinion about this part or that part. It's just not helpful. It's like I'm always happy to give my opinion, like while a game is in production, but I also know that, like having developed games myself, like you're getting so much input from all sides. It's like the team has the hard job of taking all of that input and then figuring out, okay, well, now what are we going to actually do? And you can't make everybody happy all the time. You have to make choices that hopefully add up to something coherent. So yeah, Warrior Within, not so much. I mean, it doesn't reflect my taste and my style the way that The Sands of Time did. But also I know that now with 20 years passage of time, for a lot of people, it's just an integral part of the Sands of Time trilogy. They loved it, they enjoyed it, and they have good memories of it. So I think my, that quote I gave to Wired, probably shouldn't give it too much weight.
Very well. In 2010, the Prince of Persia: Sands of Time movie was released. Now, you talked in the past about the production process and the changes that have been made. With over a decade since its release, how do you view the film's legacy and its place within the Prince of Persia franchise?
Yeah. So in 2003, like when Sands of Time shipped, and the team went on to do the next games in the series, I went back to LA and I developed a screenplay pitch based on the game, which I teamed up with John August, a great guy, a screenwriter and director in his own right. And he was kind of my mentor in screenwriting. So together we went and pitched it to Disney and to Jerry Bruckheimer. So I actually got the gig of writing the first draft of the Prince of Persia movie, which was, for me, in many ways, that was kind of like the closing of the loop that, since I was a kid, I'd wanted to make movies. Prince of Persia was a game that was inspired by movies. The Apple II game was specifically inspired, by Raiders of the Lost Ark and Thief of Baghdad, the 1938 Robin Hood. So, it really felt like kind of poetic and, very satisfying to me that after all these years, Prince of Persia was the script that I would get to write that would actually be filmed. So what was it like? It was exciting. It was, being the screenwriter of a movie of that scale, which is like a giant Hollywood blockbuster production with a cast of thousands. It's really like the circus. like literally they come and build tents in the middle of the desert, and there's trucks, and people are flying in, and everybody's doing their thing, and I'm just one person in the midst of all this, thinking, all of this started with an Apple II. So it was a great and exciting experience as a screenwriter. Technically, like I look at my draft and then I look at the version that was filmed, and of course, like I always feel like, there were things in my version that I feel like actually worked better than what was on the screen, and but all screenwriters feel that way. There was so at the moment that the movie came out, I was I was still so close to it because I was kind of remembering my version and saying, oh, so that's what they did. I think with the passage of time, now I feel like in a weird way, the movie like looks better than it did then. It looks better than ever. And I'm now meeting people who are like, in their late 20s, early 30s, who saw the movie as a kid. And they're saying, I love that movie. It's, and they have good memories of it. They've seen it many times, at different ages. And I'm actually like, I meet a fair number of people now who, for them, Prince of Persia is the movie, and they loved it. And they're actually not the right age to have played either the original Prince of Persia or A Sands of Time. So that's kind of interesting. And that's a perspective that I have now that I couldn't really see in 2010. But there's a whole generation of movie viewers who remember Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time movie at a certain time, and that it stands on its own.
Just like there's an entire generation of people who were introduced to Prince of Persia with the Sands of Time game.
Yeah, and that's another thing that's interesting, because in 2002, 2003, when we were making the Sands of Time, we were thinking, okay, the people who remember Prince of Persia, are, in their, in their 30s, 40s. Well, in 2000, I mean, I was one of the older people on the team. I think I was 36, but most of the people on the Sands of Time team, in Montreal were in their 20s or early 20s. So some of them had been, kind of too young to play the first Prince of Persia when it came out. But now, people who played the Sands of Time 20 years ago, have kids of their own. So it might be the grandparents who remember the first Prince of Persia, and the parents who played the Sands of Time, and then the kids today, the Lost Crown is going to be their first Prince of Persia game. So it's really, depending what age you are, it's really spanned at this point 3 generations.
So you're placing me in the grandparents' age group. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, didn't mean to do that, but I've definitely met grandparents who've shared Prince of Persia with their kids and grandkids. So not us, but it's
we're young.
Yeah.
Now, you've mentioned in the past that the general plot of the movie is what you've written, but the main changes were in the dialogue and the finer details. Can you name a few of the changes that have been made to the script that have been so drastic that you noticed them immediately? Was all the dialogue changed?
Yeah, pretty much all the dialogue in the movie is different. And actually, for anyone who's interested, the screenplay that I wrote for the Prince of Persia movie is, I've put it on my website at jordanmechner.com, in the Prince of Persia library section, along with the rotoscope videos and the Sands of Time game script and all of that. So you can actually read it, and it's it's interesting to see what changed. Really, it's the story, the characters, and the structure that came through. But pretty much every line of dialogue is different. And the exact characterizations have changed. I mean, just to take a few, Nizam is the king's brother in the final film, but in the original, that relationship didn't exist. The film begins with showing Dastan as as a street kid being adopted by the king. There's sort of a kind of a prologue showing his childhood, and that wasn't in the script. I just started the script like with the army preparing to attack Alamut. I mean, but dozens of things like that. the assassins, the sort of team that's pursuing the prince and princess throughout the movie, that's kind of like adds sort of a second plot, a second set of enemies. Like I didn't have that. My structure was simpler. It was just Nizam and the king's army that's chasing the main characters.
Given the fact that the script is available on your website, maybe someone will produce a version of it so that you'll have the Mechner cut for Prince of Persia, just like we have the Snyder cut for Justice League.
Oh man, I don't think it's possible. Because a script is written like in a specific situation at a specific time, and movies have changed too since 2004, 2005. I mean, Pirates of the Caribbean was kind of the model, both in pitching it, and also I think Disney was kind of hoping to do another Pirates of the Caribbean. But even from the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie to the fourth, you can kind of see how like the movies kind of got bigger and longer, plots got more complicated. CGI started to be used like more and more for things that 5 years before would have been done like on the set or in some other way. So it's it was a script written for that time, for that purpose. I don't feel like it has a lot of interest to go back and try to reconstruct it now. It's I'm happy for things to just keep moving forward.
Speaking of things moving forward, in 2011, RoboCop director Paul Verhoeven confirmed that he's working on a film adaptation of The Last Express in collaboration with you. And given that it was 2011, the idea was to film it in 3D, which was pretty popular at the time. What became of that project?
Yeah, so that was, I love Paul Verhoeven. He's one of my, one of the great directors of the 80s. I mean, his European films are great. And then his Hollywood films, like RoboCop, are iconic. I spent a year writing the script for the Last Express movie with Paul, and had his feedback. We got the script to where we wanted it. We were both pretty happy with it. Now, the issue was that we didn't get the money to film it. It would have been about a 20 million euro film. So that's a film I would have loved to make. I would have loved to see what Verhoeven did with it. And in 3D, again, I think that was a moment. Like to do it in 2011 as a 3D movie made sense. I mean, if it were to happen now, I'm not sure that would be on the table.
Yeah. Too costly.
Well, it's just a matter of kind of what's cool and what gets people excited. At that moment, it was new. 3D was new, and it was exciting. And Paul was excited about what he could do with it in 3D with the technology at that time. I think to revive a project, in a different time, you kind of have to reconceive it. Honestly, I think that if The Last Express were to get made today, it would be more likely to happen as a series than as a feature film, as it was 12 years ago.
In 2013, The Last Express Gold Edition was released to mobile devices as well as to Steam. This happened after you reacquired the rights to the game the year prior to that. What can you share about the development of this version of The Last Express?
Dotemu, the French company that developed it, they brought it to mobile, and then they added the Gold Edition features to make it kind of more accessible, more playable on mobile and also, first of all, it wasn't point and click, so that meant the whole interface had to be different. And then also, I just thought that players today would kind of want to at least have hints, be available, and to, whereas the standards of adventure games in 1997, a certain amount of frustration, was kind of more acceptable than it is today.
Yeah, games nowadays have too much hand-holding, if you ask me.
Yeah, and for people who want to play The Last Express, like in its pure original edition, without the hints and without the changes to the interface. I believe that on GOG.com, it's you can play the original PC version, so that's also out there.
So in April 2020, just in time for the 30th anniversary celebrations of Prince of Persia, you released a new edition of your Making of Prince of Persia book, which I have right here. And first of all, it makes for an interesting read, like I said before. One question, did you ever consider removing some entries that may be too personal or too harsh during the publishing process of this book?
Yeah, it's interesting. Publishing the journals, I mean, of course, I didn't include every single entry, because if I included all of my journals from like 1982 to 1993, this would be like a 3,000-page book. And most of what I wrote in my journal didn't have anything to do with game development or with my creative pursuits. I also wrote about my friends and family and love stories and everything that was going on in my life. So for the selection that I did for the Prince of Persia book, I tried to take the entries that would, be the right size for a book. That is, it wouldn't be too much to read. But I also tried to keep in everything that was relevant, everything that was sort of part of that story of making Prince of Persia and releasing it, and also keep in enough of the entries that sort of talked about the human and family and side of what that was to go through that. So it was really just judgment calls. There was, it was long enough ago that I didn't mind if an entry showed me being kind of, stupid about something, or obviously in the wrong, on some subject that I was all worked up about, because that's part of it, and that should stay in there. But mostly when I cut things out, it was just because I felt like it was just too much to read about something that just didn't connect with the story. That at that point it would just become, too much. Yeah.
First of all, you should try releasing the 3,000-page version of the journal. I would read that. And you talked about the Wired article that you think was too harsh for the time. But for example, in the book, there's an entry in which you discover who the marketing manager is for Prince of Persia. And you mention how much you wanted it to be someone else. So, it's a 2-line entry. You could have removed it, but you left it in. So first of all, kudos for you for leaving it in, for authenticity. But then again, why?
Yeah, that's the sort of thing that was a tough call. That was... I remember looking at that entry and thinking, would that hurt her feelings? Would she feel bad reading that now? Should I take it out? But then I felt, but it was so important to that whole year, of my life, the sort of the struggle of is this game going to get well marketed? Is it going to be a hit? So to take out things that were, so crucial to how that story went, I felt like, then at that point, it just becomes like a sort of a censored version of the story. It's not really telling the whole thing. And I also felt that it had been long enough. The company didn't exist anymore. I don't know what, most of the people who were in that story, we hadn't stayed in touch, and I don't know what many of them are doing today. Some of them I've stayed, in touch with and stayed friends with. And so I was pretty sure that they would be okay with it. That there was, there was nothing in the book that, that somebody who was close to me would really feel, hurt by or saddened by. So, that one was borderline, I admit.
Well, again, I appreciate the fact that you left it in, because it helps with the authenticity. You had the journals and you choose what to add to the book. Maybe you had some future predictions that went wrong, so you decided to remove those. Or maybe you can add predictions to the book.
Well, that was sort of my one rule, in editing it, because I wanted the book to be my journals, not some kind of retrospective retelling of the story, but I just wanted to select from what I wrote in my journals. So the rule was that I can subtract, but I can't add. So I didn't give myself permission to add a sentence, that would have tied things together or made it seem like basically every sentence that's in the journals is an actual sentence, that I wrote at the time. But then, of course, there's tens of thousands of other sentences that I took out. So I was allowed to cut, just not to add.
You could have added July 2nd, 1992. I have a sense that social media will ruin the world in about 30 years.
For example, and instead of that, we have my brilliant reflection, in 1982 or 1983. Who knows if there's even going to be a computer game industry 3 years from now?
Yeah, computers are passing fad.
Oh, smart. Yeah.
In September 2020, it was revealed that Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time remake was in production. The game was supposed to feature Yuri Leventhal's voice as the prince. And in addition to that, the developers also recorded motion capture sessions with him. And furthermore, the developers also contacted you to hear what was cut from the original game in order to re-implement it in the remake. And that game was supposed to come out in 2021 and then pushed back to 2022 and then pushed back indefinitely. Do you have any updates regarding the status of this project?
Well, on my website, I always post a link to the latest update from the team, on my Sands of Time page. Because, at one point, the game actually had a release date and, the trailer had been shown. But what happened, was that the response from the Prince of Persia community to that trailer and to that version of the remake, was mixed. A lot of people thought this, it should be better. And, Ubisoft actually listened to that and said, this is the Sands of Time. We don't want to do a remake that's going to be received as kind of middling. It should have been better. They wanted to make the best possible version of the remake. So they actually pretty much started over with a new team in Montreal, which is working on the remake now. So I'm not on the team, and I wasn't on the team in India that did the first version of the remake either. My input was basically limited to just having a conversation, where they asked me, questions about the development of Sands of Time. Why were certain things done? Were there other, what did we have to cut because of lack of time or lack of resources? And so, I shared that with them, and they talked to other team members as well, I'm sure, and asked them the same questions and got all of the documentation that they could, from the first Sands of Time development. And I think my most concrete contribution was probably to put them in touch with Yuri Lowenthal, who is, we had met in 2003, 2002, 2003 for the voice recording for Sands of Time. And after that became friends and neighbors in Los Angeles. And, we've become good friends. So I was able to give them Yuri's current contact information and also give them the information that he's still working as an actor in video games, and in fact had just done Spider-Man for Sony. So, he hasn't lost a step. And so I think the team really enjoyed, and Yuri really enjoyed going back and redoing those cinematics with, 2020 technology. But as to the current version of the remake, the updates come from the team in Montreal, and I think there's every reason to think that it's going to be a really high quality and well done remake, and I hope that players having wished for this will now be patient until the game arrives.
You mentioned Yuri's work on Spider-Man, but more importantly, he narrated the audiobook of the making of Prince of Persia.
Yes, Yuri is a multi-talented actor, director, producer, and he read he did the audiobook of my Prince of Persia journals. It was a strange experience to hear 22-year-old me being played by Yuri. But I think he did it better than I could have done it.
In 2023, the making of Karateka was released. And I have to say that this was a great way to showcase the journal and the information that was documented by you in a very interactive way. And while I was playing / experiencing the making of Karateka, I noticed that this has more interactivity than most of the games that were released in 2023. So kudos on that. And how did the idea to create an interactive documentary / game / museum come up?
So Digital Eclipse contacted me, with the idea of doing a making of Karateka, that would be playable, that would contain the games. And, I said yes to this, not realizing how deeply they would go into it or what an incredible product they would come up with. I mean, the making of Karateka is, to me, it's like walking through a wing of a museum that for some reason is dedicated to this, 3 or 4 year period of my life when I was making games on the Apple II. I mean, they've pulled out, images off floppy disks that I hadn't seen in 40 years. They took my journal entries and kind of linked them with particular sketches and particular builds of the game and reconstructed a coherent timeline. And then, of course, interviewing my dad and getting him to talk about the game after all these years, this game that he'd composed the music for, and then interviewing Veda Cook and other, people who were involved. So it was very touching, very moving for me to see everything that they'd done and all of the attention that they'd lavished on it. And I think it's just a great documentary, for anybody who wants to understand that era and kind of know what it was like making games back then and sort of understand more of the kind of the technical challenges, that we were working with. It's, I feel, very lucky that they put all of that effort into doing it.
And I especially like the fact that you have the percentage of completed levels. So you always have to make it to 100. So I always notice that if I reach 90% and I have to rewatch everything again or to see if I missed a page in one of the illustrations. So again, great job on that documentary / game.
Yeah, the Digital Eclipse. I think with the Gold Master series, they've sort of created a model that can hopefully can be used for other games as well to tell the stories of how other games got made.
Now we reached 2024. Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown was released a month ago, and from what I've seen on social media, it seemed like you were enjoying it thoroughly, and the game also got great reviews. So what can you tell us about the game?
Yeah, so The Lost Crown is developed here in Montpellier in the south of France, where I live now. And so I know the team. I've worked with them on other Prince of Persia projects in the past. And I'm just so happy that they got to make this game and that it's, I'm enjoying it as a player. I'm actually playing it right now on Nintendo Switch. As of this conversation, I have not yet beaten it, but I'm determined to. It's, to me, it's just, I've always liked 2D games as a player. And this is it's simultaneously, very modern Metroidvania, with a lot of depth and a sort of a semi-open world that you can really explore in different ways. And the combat also leaves a lot of room for player expression. There's many ways that you can get through every moment. So I'm just enjoying it.
Let's talk about Replay, your new graphic novel that came out in French last year and will be released on March 19th of this year in English. You have a copy in the back over there.
Yes, I just got the first English copies of Replay. I can see it's a hardcover.
Wow.
And, yeah, and it's yeah, and here, wait, I'll show you this. On the back cover, there's a little Easter egg there. Can you see under the back flap?
Oh, it's the sprite animation.
Yeah.
I think, when I was going over the manuals of Prince of Persia, I think there was one manual in which there was on each corner of the page one of the frames of Prince of Persia, and then if you flip through them, you actually see him running.
Yeah, there was a flip book. Here, let me do the flap again because I didn't.
Wow.
Easter egg. Yeah, so sorry, I just got carried away because the book just arrived, and it's it's a nice feeling after working on a book for 2 years and then having it be out in French for the first year to now be able to hold the printed hardcover English version in my hand.
Now, I got a chance to read it all the way through, and I really enjoyed it. First of all, I was pleasantly surprised that even though I read your Karateka and Prince of Persia journals, this graphic novel didn't try to rehash any of the details in those journals, and the focus was more on the broader picture of your life at the time, with juxtapositions between your life, your father's life, and your grandfather's life. I also love the fact that you utilized the graphic novel medium to tell a more cinematic story than you could have in a regular novel. For example, the switches between the timelines felt seamless because you could actually keep track of which timeline you're in according to the color palette, which is unique for each timeline. And I believe that in a regular book, it would have been confusing to switch back and forth between all of these timelines. So when did you decide that it was time to tell the Mechner family story? And why did you choose the graphic novel as the medium to tell it?
Yeah, graphic novels are really a special medium. And in a way, it's the first medium that I loved and worked in as a kid, because I was 12, 13 years old when the Apple II came along and I got into programming. But if it weren't for that, I probably would have kept on drawing comics and maybe wanted to make animated movies. So that's a medium of storytelling that's it feels very natural to me. And I've loved when I was a kid in New York, it was Mad Magazine, that kind of comics. And then later in my 20s, I came to France and discovered French European graphic novels with authors like Hugo Pratt and Jacques Tardy, which inspired specifically The Last Express, but also just inspired me in general in terms of visual storytelling. And there's so many great traditions. Will Eisner has done amazing work. There have been books like Mouse by Art Spiegelman, and just, thousands and thousands of, graphic novels are as rich a form, as cinema in a different way. And there's things you can do in a graphic novel that don't really have an equivalent in film or in, prose literature or in video games. And one example, what you mentioned is that in Replay, I have 3 different timelines going in parallel. I'm telling my memories of making games in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and sort of drawing myself with the computers of that period, and then the people, the episodes, that readers of the Making of Karateka and Making of Prince of Persia journals have read in journal form. I'm kind of putting those on the page, as real-time action. And so it's a chance to show the people, show the places, and show kind of the moments in between the moments that are in the journals. Things like when Tomy, was pushing me to add sword fighting to the game, to Prince of Persia, which at that time was only traps. And so in a graphic novel, you can go from a scene in an office with 2 people talking to show the screen of the video game to show something else, like the outside of the building. And it's there's no real equivalent to that. And like if you did that in film, it would seem kind of artificial and mannered. So there's that blue timeline, which is my memories, and then there's a yellow timeline, which is the present day. That's kind of the frame story. Me as an adult, with 35 years of Prince of Persia, behind us, moving to France to do a new Prince of Persia project, and now with 2 teenage kids. So Los Angeles and Montpellier is the yellow timeline. And then there's the sepia timeline, which is my memories of, not my memories, but the memories of my dad and my grandfather telling me about their adventures as, my dad is a child refugee in World War II in occupied France, trying to survive and trying to get out to reunite with his parents on the other side of the Atlantic. My grandfather, who I should mention, my family is from Vienna, Austria, and had to flee in 1938. So my grandfather actually ended up in Cuba, in Havana, separated from his, from my grandmother and from their 2 kids. So for a few years, the family was separated that way. So what they told me about all of that, amazing, harrowing adventures that they went through, I drew that in sepia, with the third color, because these are things that I didn't witness, but I was told about. So those 3 timelines, each being in their own color, kind of make it possible for the reader to track them and to not get lost, even though there's these jumps in time, often within the page, because it's a graphic novel and because of this sort of monochrome or bichrome color palette, becomes very easy to follow. Whereas in a film, I think it would be harder to track and easier to get lost.
And are there any plans to further adapt the story for other media, such as film or television, or maybe a point-and-click adventure game?
Yeah. I really wanted to do, I wanted to tell this story. And I think the graphic novel medium is really the only way that I could have done it. It's both very intimate, because you can have, very sort of internal, personal moments and emotions. And at the same time, it's capable of showing epic events like battles in World War I and, bombed out cities, and also even things like, the details of developing, animation for a video game. I think it's only the graphic novel form that's capable of doing all of those things, and also to do it with complete creative control and with sort of the time and the piece to try to find the right way to tell it. In a film or in a video game, you have there's marketing considerations, there's production considerations. You have a team that needs to have a schedule and that kind of needs to know what to do every day. So there's a pressure on that kind of development, which is great and it's exciting, and I love that too. But for this particular story, because it's so personal and so intimate, and I didn't yet know going into it how I was going to find a way to tell all of this within one book, it really had to be a graphic novel. And also because I love to draw, and it's something I've been doing since I was a kid, there's something very there's something very intimate about drawing places that I remember, places that have been important to me, and people that I know so well, and just the challenge of trying to capture their gesture, the way that they would say something. And because when it's right, I know it. I'm like, I can sort of imagine, I can hear their voice saying it in just the way they would say it. But I'm the only person who could draw that because I knew them. And so casting an actor or building a 3D model that would resemble a character, it's just a different thing. I wouldn't do it for replay.
So you drew all of these locations from memory?
I did a lot of research to draw replay. There's things that I remember, but as with the rotoscoping, in Prince of Persia and Karateka. It's one thing to have an image in my head of like, yeah, I know how a person runs. I've seen it a million times. But then to actually look at a film of somebody running, it's like, oh, that's interesting. His arm did this. So in drawing replay, I just looked at all of the documentation I could. Obviously, for the for the 1900s, the 1920s and 30s and 40s, Europe, I needed to look at newsreel footage and photographs and just documentation to know what those places looked like. But even for my own memories, for drawing like what my Apple II computer setup looked like on my desk, when I was making Karateka or Prince of Persia, I still, I looked at photos, and thanks to the incredible retro gaming community that has uploaded pictures of all this stuff, I could see, okay, I could find a Versa writer, I could find a joystick, I could find all the, and I could remember, the hairstyles and the way that we dressed and the way that the computer stores of the late 70s kind of had racks of magazines. It really helped me to look at all of that documentation before I drew it, to just kind of refresh my memory about the details. I love sort of putting Easter eggs into things. And in drawing replay, I often, like in the background of a frame, I would put like a poster or just an object that kind of made me smile because either because it had a double meaning in the story or because that object was actually there at the time. So doing that research and kind of looking up and figuring out what movie posters did I have in my office, when I was making Prince of Persia in 1986, 87, and what kind of posters would have been on the wall when my dad was walking to school in Nice, in 1941. I really enjoy that kind of research, and I enjoy drawing it.
And while I was reading replay, I enjoyed looking at some of these drawings and trying to figure out if they're based on actual locations, and then try to find them online. For example, this location.
Yep, and you can see I flipped it, right?
Yeah, you flipped it.
Yeah.
You even have the no entry sign over here. And the Eiffel Tower is on the left over here, but on the right over here. And that's the cafe. So I did my own research on replay.
Well, good find. Yeah, I did that a lot. Sometimes I would mirror settings just for reasons of flow on the page. And actually one big one is my dad's, my grandparents' apartment in Vienna in 1938. On the first page of the book, you see Hitler is passing down underneath their window, with the parade as he's entering Vienna in 1938, and the family is standing at the window looking out. Well, that's actually their building, and my dad had shared his memories of that day, and that building is still there in Vienna. So I was able to go back and visit it and look at it from the street, and then kind of reconstruct the way that it would have looked then. But in the end, I mirrored it because it just felt right on the second page of the book to have them looking off to the right, sort of, seeing the Nazi parade entering Vienna. It's like they're looking into the future, and their past life in Vienna is behind them. Just visually, the past is on the left, the future is on the right. And so in order to see the depth of the apartment behind them in that panel, like their bay window needed to be, on the south side, on the north side of the street instead of on the south side. So it's their actual building, but I just flipped it. And that's something where I thought, no, it's not going to bother anybody at this point that the building faced the other way. It's really just about the reading experience.
It bothered me because I needed to make sure that it's the correct location. I wasn't sure. Maybe it was a different cafe. Now I know.
Yeah. And by the way, on my website, because I love posting behind the scenes stuff, and like the website is kind of just a way to add more information for people who've enjoyed my books or games and are just kind of curious. I've put an annex for a replay where, not for every page, but for some sequences, I've kind of explained like how I did it, like what reference materials I used, and what liberties I took. So like the thing about mirroring the building, I sort of explained that, and I also put the photograph that I have showing that building, you know, as it was in 1960, and then a photo of it that I took today. Because I think that kind of stuff is it's interesting from a craft point of view, like especially if you're like writing and drawing comics, and it's also just, I think I'm always interested in, you know, kind of finding out what the source materials were and where things came from.
Now, before we conclude our conversation, one last question from me. What are your plans for 2024, and how can people stay in touch with you and your work?
Okay, well, we're having this conversation in February, and in a few weeks, in March 2024, I'm going to get on a plane and go back to New York, to the U.S., where I'm from, for the U.S. release of Replay. So I'm always happy to go back to New York because my dad and brother and, you know, a lot of my family are there. And living in France, you know, I don't get to go there so many times a year. But this trip is also going to be special because it's going to be, you know, this book that has been so important to me and that's already out in France, which I've been able to share with people and with readers here in France in French, you know, for the last, you know, 8-9 months. I'm now going to be able to share and talk about in English. So I'm very excited about that. I'll also be going to the Game Developers Conference in March and talk about Karateka and do a retrospective talk about that that development, which coincides nicely with the Digital Eclipse playable documentary. So all of that's going to be in mid-March. So that's what's it's coming up for me. And of course, in the meantime, I'm working on my next projects, next books, you know, which are, you know, a couple of books that I've written the script for that are being illustrated by other artists. One project that might be might already be announced by the time that your podcast airs is an English version of a book that it's a trilogy in French. It's a modern version of The Count of Monte Cristo, and it's been updated to modern day to America in the post 9/11 period. So we've taken Dumas' original story and adapted it to modern day politics. Mario Alberti is a wonderful Italian illustrator who lives in Trieste. And so we're just about to publish the third volume of this book in France. And then in March, I think we're going to announce the English version, which is going to be published as a single graphic novel. So that's coming up too.
Sounds awesome. This conversation will premiere on March 17th, so Replay will come out in 2 days from now.
Oh, great. Yeah, you already know the date. So March 19th is Replay, and then I think the day after that, I'll be going to GDC. So anybody watching this who's going to GDC, maybe I'll see you there.
Well, thank you, Jordan, for taking the time to join me for a conversation today. It's been a true honor and an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I've really enjoyed it. And thank you for the depth of research that you put into this. You know, it's it must have taken a long time to read all of those materials and prepare. It was
just a couple of months, no biggie.
Well, thank you.